What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from Yu-Gi-Oh from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be another tournament report and meta discussion for not one, not two, well, actually just two retro Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments that wrapped up this past week. The first of which I'm just going to talk about is the Fiber Jar tournament, the Fiber Format Monthly 5, the Air Knight Express, so named after Air Knight Parshath, which did pretty decently in the last tournament. But this was a very, very exciting tournament. 23 people joined. And the deck type representation here, which is provided by formatlibrary.com, which has the full coverage of both this and the other tournament that I'm going to talk about. So, I'll link those in the description if you do want to head over there afterwards. The deck type representation here said that 18 people were on Tomato Control, 2 people were on Recruiter Control, 1 was on Rad Toolbox, 1 was on Gear Freed, and 1 was on Last Turn. And I can tell you right now that this is not quite accurate because the way that the algorithm that Format Library uses to classify the different decks, sort of falls apart a little bit for a lot of decks in the DM era. So I can tell you right now that the winning deck list here was classified as Tomato Control, but it isn't quite what people would view as Tomato Control. Still, seeing all these different deck types represented here, does give a hint as to the different sorts of decks you can play in this format. You can play just the sort of good stuff sort of Tomato Control list, only playing the 3 sets of, or not 3 sets, but 3 copies of Tomato, going to things like Sangan and Witch, and just playing just good stuff cards outside of that. But you can also lean in more heavily into the recruiter stuff with like tomatoes and rats and maybe creature swaps and things like that for recruiter control. You can play Gear Freed with Blast with Chain for a Gear Freed deck. There are a variety of different things that you can play in this format, even though the chart here makes it look like it's just tier 1. But also an important thing to note about formats like this in the DM era is that there is a lot of similarities between the different decks. Sure, decks are playing slightly different strategies. Some are going more aggressive, some are being more controlling. But there is a lot of overlap between the deck lists themselves. So, if that's something that's not really for you in these sorts of formats, then, you might not enjoy this. But I do encourage you to check it out if you're interested in it, even if you think you might be put off by that sort of thing. Because I do think that a lot of the times, people may look at the deck list and be like, oh, those decks are all the same. But then once you get into the format, you realize, oh, these decks actually play somewhat differently, even though they have a lot of overlap in their list. So that's going to do it for the deck type representation here, which, I'm not going to spend too much time on for this or the other DM era tournament that we're talking about here because, frankly, it's not really that accurate for this era. But let's dive into the deck list now and talk about what the topping lists either had in common or did differently from decks in the past. This is the third place deck list from Rubo LZ playing Tomato Control. And, this is somewhat interesting because Tomato Control has sort of fallen a little bit out of favor in, comparison to things like Tomato decks and Rat Box decks combined together into Recruiter Control decks. So playing 3 copies of Tomato, 3 copies of Rat has been very good in the past. But maybe people felt like, the metagame is sort of shifting against that and people are going to be taking a lot of options to stop that sort of thing. So maybe, they wanted to go for the more standard Tomato Control sort of build here. Also, if you are playing this deck, it is just a bunch of good cards put together. So, it is still very individually powerful on its own too. And, this showed here because this deck managed to get 3rd place. So congrats to Rubo LZ for actually managing to pull this one off. I think this is a pretty good starting deck if you want to play a Tomato Control deck in this format. There are some things that aren't necessarily standard among all the lists, like Cyberjar isn't necessarily in every single list that plays this sort of thing. Also, 3 Jar of Greed, 1 Time Seal isn't necessarily standard. People have sort of gone back and forth about how many of these you should play, but playing them here to fuel things like your Bazoo the Soul Eater is very good because at this time in this format you can actually banish anything from grave with Bazoo, not just monsters. So having these sort of graveyard fodder things is very, very nice there. Also 1 TT, 1 Trap Hole, definitely not like sort of the standard ratios of that, but I think it does make sense. Trap Hole is very good if you want to preserve your own beaters here, just like in Android format where this tech sees a lot more play there. But the TTs can be good against things like Scapegoat, which is a new inclusion in this format. So I do think this is a pretty good trap lineup overall. And honestly, it's just a good place to start out if you want to play this sort of list in the future, just to test out Fiber format. There's a good starting place. Or if you want to potentially, do well in a tournament. But, the side deck is also relatively standard. One interesting thing to note here is that Duo is in the side deck. This is something that I generally do in this format because I do feel like Duo is a little bit worse in this format than in some of the other ones, especially if people are resetting the card advantage with things like Fiber Jar, and Sinister Serpent is now very accessible in this format. I think Duo is a little bit less valuable than something like Comfy or Forceful, but it's still in here for the side in case you're going first. And it's definitely not necessarily a standard way to play this. There are plenty of people who put Duo in the main deck, but, clearly here it worked out well for Rubo LZ. So I'm just going to use this as a bit of confirmation bias that, you know, this is something that I'll continue doing, even though, you know, there are arguments for just including the main deck, but I think it might be a little bit overrated in this format. But I just wanted to put that bit of propaganda out there against Duo. Let's dive into the deck list now. The second place deck list is by Dump Truck here, and this is another sort of good stuff tomato control sort of list. This one is playing Duo on the main deck, so, you know, I might have said, you know, I approve of Ruba LZ cutting it from the main deck, but, you know, Dump Truck managed to get second with it in the main deck, so that's an argument for keeping it in if you want sort of more data points here. There are also some other things here that I think make this a little bit cleaner of a deck. You know, double TT here instead of the one trap hole, one TT. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's just good to be consistent in the sort of removal you have. Although the trap hole versus TT thing can keep people guessing, I think the TT is generally a bit more versatile. Stops things like Yata Garasu, which is a real problem. Stops things like Injection Fairy Lily. Also stops special summons off something like Monster Reborn. So I think this is a very, very good card, and I do prefer TT to Trap Hole in this format, although I do see why you would play Trap Hole. Also for the beater lineup, triple Gemini Elf, one Kaiku, and one Bazoo here. So this is not necessarily the same lineup of beaters that Ruba LZ had, and I do think that, you know, this is a lineup that I like. You don't necessarily want to play too many Bazoos because, you know, later on in the game, you'll have less resources in grave if you play too many. So you want to have a full graveyard for when you eventually drop Bazoo, but if you're using a ton of them, you run out of resources really quick. And also, you know, Fiber Jar, Bazoo banishes can be a bit awkward, and you can sometimes find yourself in a spot where, like, you banish powerful things from grave that you'd want back in deck after a Fiber Jar resolution, and then you don't have access to those after the Fiber Jar resolves. So I think this is a very, very good list. I think, you know, there are a lot of similarities here between this list and Ruba LZ's list, and that's because, you know, this deck is very good, and there are only a couple different ways that you can really play this deck. There are tech cards you can use. I mean, we've seen that in Android format, where once this deck sort of became dominant there, the format basically turned into finding the best tech cards to use with it. But I think here, you know, this is a pretty solid version of this list here. But, you know, the winning deck list of this event was actually not Tomato Control. So let's dive into that one now. The winner of this event was GBO on this Gearfried list. Now, this is classified as Tomato Control on the Format Library website. I'm not quite sure why, maybe because it's got triple tomatoes in the side deck here, but that's just part of a sort of side deck smokescreen into Recruiter Control with the triple giant rat and the triple tomato along with double creature swap here. So it's very interesting that GBO has that option in this deck, just sort of lean all in on that. But Gearfried managed to win this tournament, which is pretty cool for Gearfried. You know, Gearfried has won in the past, so it's not like an unknown deck, but I do think that a lot of people soured on it, and I myself soured on it as well, because I do think the deck can be very bricky. You know, Blast with Chain can be a nice card with Gearfried, but if you draw the Gearfried without the Blast, or the Blast without the Gearfried, it can be a bit awkward. But I think GBO has gone a long way into shoring up some of the complaints with Gearfried, making it just into a much more aggressive deck. You know, it's playing double Assure Priest to deal with the Recruiter Control decks, and also deal with things like Scapegoat, which can give this deck a lot of problems here. Got Zambira as well for the flexibility to search off of a Rhoda. I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on this list. Also, a relatively low monster count because, you know, your Assure Piece can dodge removal. Yata Garasu can also dodge removal. And this deck, if you just get aggressive enough early on, you can potentially set up the auto lock just by depleting your opponent of enough resources. And also, you know, triple TT here is very good to pair with the 3 spirits here. So I think there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on in this list. And I think it is a very, very good list. And I think that this is probably the best Gearfried list I've seen in Fiber format so far. You know, I think a lot of people maybe doubted Gearfried because it just had, you know, not necessarily suboptimal lists, but like I do think that the list that came before it just did not feel as clean in this one. So actually, I think I might try out this list on the channel just to test it out because I think it is a really, really good list for Gearfried, and I think it could potentially change the way I see the deck. But still, this is a very, very good topping list, and I think it might cause a slight shift in the tier list for Fiber format. So let's dive into that tier list now. So here's the last tier list I made for Fiber format, and it took actually opening this up to realize how old this tier list is, because in the time since this tier list happened, you know, Recruiter Control managed to top multiple events. So I would place Recruiter Control in tier 1. I'm surprised that that wasn't there earlier, but I guess this was, you know, back when the last Gearfried list topped. But, you know, in between this list and now, I probably would have actually dropped Gearfried down to tier 2 just because it hadn't seen many results. And I sort of had soured on the deck a little bit. Like, I think my victory with it was mainly through luck and not necessarily through Gearfried itself. But after this last win with GBO, I would place it in tier 1. So I do think that the tier 1 decks for now are Bazooka the Soul Eater, so just Tomato Control, sort of good stuff, be Spellcaster stuff. Recruiter Control with the creature swaps and the Tomato package and Giant Rat package together. And also Gearfried here. And that would be sort of my tier 1 status. for this format right now, this still is a very underexplored format, so things can definitely change. Maybe things like hand control will get better, or maybe people will break fiends or something. But I think right now this is, sort of where I see things settling. And I do think also in the future that some of these tier 1 decks could fall down a tier. Part of the reason why decks like this do well in these underexplored formats is because people aren't really prepared for them. And so I think that now that Gearfried's sort of back on the menu as a respectable deck, maybe people will learn how to play around it or side against it, and it could definitely go back down a tier a bit. So I do think that, this is what I'd say for now. And, just to sort of put this out there, the way I classify these tiers is that tier 1 is decks that I think could win a tournament reasonably in the future. Tier 2 is decks that I think, have a good chance of topping, but not necessarily a good chance of winning. Rogue decks are decks that I don't really think have a good chance of topping, but, they can win your average games here. Like, you will win a couple games with them. And trash tier is just decks that I really don't see winning many games at all, right? They could win one game here or there, but realistically, there's too pie in the sky to actually, make it higher here. So this would sort of do it for my tier list here. And if you want to know more of these decks, like this is hand control, hot ass in tier 2 there for hand control and fiends. You've got last turn and dragons and rogue. I still think that they belong in rogue. I don't really think much has changed there. And you've got Gradius and also just pure spirits in the trash tier, because I don't really think anything's changed there as well. But that's going to do it for the tier list here. I just wanted to do this brief update here because I do think that the new result with Gearfried does reflect a sort of shift in the meta here. And also, apparently this tier list was so old that recruiter control was not where it should have been here. But this is sort of my tier list for the future. So I do think that if you want to win a tournament with Fiber in the future, I think that, any of these top 3 decks could be one that you should go for. But I'm not going to say that none of these other decks can do well. I think it just takes a lot more tinkering to get them there. Moving on to the second event we had the wrap-up of the Treasure Hunt 2, which was the treasure format tournament held on the Treasure Trove Discord server. I streamed the finals that the other day, so definitely check that out if you didn't see it there. And also, if you want to see more finals that I stream or just more coverage of these events in the future, definitely subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach 1,600 subscribers, and we're still quite a bit away, but it'd be really cool to reach that at some point. Hopefully either by the end of this month or early next month. That would be great. And it also helps grow the community more to buff up these tournaments a bit more, because this one only had 16 people. And I think Treasure is a good enough format to get more than 16 people on average for these tournaments. But still, even though it was a relatively small number of people, it still was a very exciting event. Unfortunately, in the deck type representation thing, you get the same problem that you run into in Fiber format, where, a lot of decks are classified as tomato control. I wouldn't necessarily call them all tomato control, even though they are classified that way here. But I can get into sort of more niche classifications as we cover the deck list. Unfortunately here, I don't think that the deck type representation actually provides a full array of like what the different decks really are. Sure, you have Germbird and Empty Jar as decks that are also in the running here in contention, but I don't really think that those decks really see much play in any super competitive capacity. I think Burn itself does, but like Germburn isn't, well, I guess if Germburn is the term for regular burn, like with chain energies and things like that, then yeah, that is definitely a tier 1 deck in my opinion. But yeah, Empty Jar is definitely something that unfortunately has just not been broken yet. Maybe in the future people will figure out a way to break it more, but right now it's not at a point where mill is a serious threat in this format. But let's dive into the topping lists and talk about what make them unique. Okay, this is the second place deck list by GMYFS here, and this is sort of like more tomato control. I would classify this probably as tomato control. It does have Banish for the Light in it, which is a spicy tech card. It also has this Last Will here, which is another spicy tech card. Can pair with a lot of different things like Cannon Soldier, etc., or just be good in the late game. If you summon out a monster, they trap hole it, and then you activate Last Will to push in for that last bit of damage. That can be very nice as well. But, this is a pretty standard sort of tomato control list. I do think it is a very, very good list if you want to sort of pick up the deck, pick up the sort of main good stuff deck in the format that doesn't really need too much foreknowledge of the format to actually play well. Like, I do think that this is pretty standard in case you have, like, good Yu-Gi-Oh fundamentals but have never played Treasure format before. I think this deck should be able to carry you somewhat far. Now, of course, you might not be able to play it at the same level as, like, GMYFS here if it's your first time playing the format. But I do think that is a very, very good deck to pick up if you're looking for something, quick and easy to pick up and play. So very, very good stuff here. I think a lot of these spice, though, comes from GBO's winning list from this format. So let's dive into that one now. Now, this is GBO's topping list, and this is a very, very spicy list here. One, it's playing more recruiters than normal. Most decks only play the 3 tomatoes, but GMYFS is, or not GMYFS, but GBO, 2 G names in the top. They're both goats, so it makes sense. But, triple Giant Rat here is not necessarily standard. So this is a bit more of a rat box deck. Also playing double Giant Soldier of Stone instead of the Banisher because you can go into this off of the rat. But another very interesting thing here is Robin Goblin. Now, Robin Goblin is a deck that, did do decently in some of the past events as well. I think on my tier list, I had this in tier 1 along with Ratbox. I sort of put them both in tier 1 there because I did think that they were both very good decks. But GBO realized here that combining this in a Ratbox deck is actually really, really strong because Giant Rat has 1450 defense. So if you set this thing down, it walls off a lot of different things in the format like tomatoes or anything below tomato. And paired with Robin Goblin, that is a card ripped out of the hand. If you're playing this sort of recruiter-focused deck, you likely have more field presence. So if you can clear away your opponent's threats, then, the Robin Goblins become even more powerful because you're more likely to get in more damage. And I just think this deck is really, really good. Of course, there are some flaws to Robin Goblin. For instance, MST exists, so your opponent can just fire an MST on the Robin Goblin, get it out of the way the moment your opponent activates it. However, that's still trading 1-for-1 with the card from hand. So, I think that's still pretty good. It's a relatively good trade either way. And I think this card is very underexplored in Treasure format overall. So it's cool to see this sort of coalesce into this one package here. Now, that being said, Ratbox has, done very well 2 tournaments in a row. Robin Goblin sort of hand control decks have also done very well in these tournaments. So I do think that, maybe we'll see more this deck tech, right? Like maybe more Banish of the Lights in the main deck, maybe more, heavy storms or things like that to stop Robin Goblins. But I think overall, this is a very, very good deck list. And if you want to pick up some premium spice in this format that may actually become meta and not spice anymore in the near future, this is definitely the one to pick up and sort of put your own stamp on the deck, just like GBO did in this tournament. So very, very cool stuff. I'm excited to see how the treasure meta continues to evolve in the future, along with the fiber meta. I think that both of them are very ripe for exploration and more experimentation in the future. And there will be more events for both of them. So definitely head on over to the Fiber Jar Discord server and the Treasure Trove Discord server linked in the description down below if you want to play in future events. Also, if you want to play games in these formats or any other format that I feature on the channel, head over to the YGO from Zero Discord server linked in the description too. And we hold monthly tournaments there as well as weekly locals. So it's a great place to get more competitive action in these formats as well. Or casual ones too. You can just casually ask for some games to get your feet wet in these formats too. But that's going to do it for this video, and I'm very, very excited to see where things go from here. It really makes me happy to see people continuing to explore these formats, continuing to play events in them, because that's sort of what I want to do with this channel. I wanted to make it a way to introduce people to new formats and inspire people to hold events in them and do more of that. So, it warms my heart to see people continue to do that, and I hope that people continue to do that in the future. So I think the future is bright for Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! And hopefully we can just keep making it even brighter in the future. If you like this sort of content and want to support me directly, then I also have a Patreon link in the description down below. And if you join the Patreon, you get shout out in these videos. So big shout outs to GMYFS, Rinswin, Pork Trapkin, Brendan Donker, Tyler Compton, and Dumpstrick. It really means a lot that you all support me this way. Encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. Again, if you like what you saw here, leave a like down below, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think of these decks. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.